Hello, hello! I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write, where I give questionable writing advice through running metaphors. Before I get started, I want to mention that the AuthorTube Writing Conference took place this past weekend. In case you missed it, there were some wonderful speakers like Dale Roberts, MK Williams, and Mandy Lynn. I was super excited for this free virtual conference and to watch all the incredibly talented writers speak on topics which interested them. In fact, I was one of the speakers who presented. I gave a talk entitled, I Don't Have My Shit Together, Imposter Syndrome Struggles, which is all about how I handle my inner doubts and how I don't let my fears control or limit my writing. One other thing, my novel's debut publishing livestream party will take place on August 6th at noon Eastern Time. I am incredibly excited after the previous livestream where I debuted my author copy of the novel, and I will be having all kinds of games, and we'll be having prizes, and I hope to see you there. It's going to be an absolute blast as we talk all things falling through. Moving on, to reach that publishing point, self-publishing has been an expensive process for me. Even before I reached publishing and distribution, I racked up a hefty sunk cost when it came to professional editing. Between the 4 stages of professional editing I performed, I spent $6,300. I don't say that to discourage or dishearten any of you out there who are looking to get your novels published or edited. I want to share my information to give you options and reliable expectations. What did I get and was it worth it? I'm about to run through each of the 4 stages of edits and discuss how I felt and whether or not I got value out of those edits. Also, if you stay to the end, I will discuss how I budgeted for those edits. Though if you don't want to stay all the way, spoiler alert, the secret had to do with delaying the publication of my novel by a decade. As I mentioned, there are 4 main types of professional edits. In the order I had them performed, they are developmental, line, copy, and proofread. The services these professional editors performed often overlapped, and there were additional subsets which, likewise, overlapped in terms of what they covered. Anyway, the first step of the professional editors is the developmental editor. Anything before that tends to be more of a critique, which isn't really an editing service in terms of what I was looking for. Now, the developmental editor should answer questions like, does the plot make sense? Should there be fewer scenes? Should there be more scenes to elaborate on something that was established? Are the character motivations believable? Are the characters flat? Are there plot holes? Etc. This can also be called a structural edit, though I've also seen that as a separate service which focused more on the flow, style, and tone. I paid $3,600 for my developmental editor, and that comes with a huge caveat. My manuscript was 98,000 words, and the professional editor I hired was going to go through it 2.5 times. That first half a read-through was more like a critique from a high level, where they mentioned things that should be changed or expanded on, or details that didn't necessarily make sense. This was like a skeleton editorial assessment to point out character motivation issues, plot points which should be changed, and conversations which needed to be adjusted so that they could be fully understood. After I fixed those issues, the editor went through my manuscript a full 2 more times, during which I would reread the complete manuscript and do my best to incorporate her suggested changes. That made this process slow, and it took a little over 6 months to complete those 2.5 read-throughs. I was fine with a lengthier timeline, as I would much rather put out something of higher quality than a story which included significant inconsistencies and plot holes. Also, during the editing process, I was able to complete the 2nd book in the series and get feedback from beta readers who also finished reading it. So I was working multiple books simultaneously. Yeah, I had a lot of sticker shock with the first step of the editing process costing me $3,600. Honestly, if it weren't for some overtime I worked right around that time with the express intention of using that money for editing, I likely would have gone with a cheaper service. Though I'm glad I didn't, because I was happy with the multiple passes for a slightly more expensive cost. In terms of looking elsewhere, I found that the average price for a 100,000 word manuscript to be roughly $1,500 to $2,000 for a single pass. One super deluxe professional developmental editor would cost $8,000 for a 100,000 word manuscript. I think they were designed more for short stories, but I don't know what their service will entail, as I was immediately dissuaded by that high price tag. That might make sense for an author selling millions of copies. For me, not so much. Given that the developmental editor I hired performed 2.5 rounds on my manuscript, I feel like I got great value for the amount of money I paid, even if it was a lot more than I was anticipating. Was this the right decision for me? Absolutely! Based on that first half a full read-through, the editor provided a report which explained portions to smooth over and details that needed to be worked on. The first half pass resolved a lot of the gaps within my story. Most of the editor's comments had to do with expanding on the explanations of the characters' decisions and actions. Instead of saying, "we're going to do X," now they would have banter about what alternatives there were, or what doing X would entail, or why doing X makes sense. Then there were the 2 full rounds of developmental edits. In a lot of ways, these both worked and didn't. Overall, these suggested changes greatly improved my story in measurable ways. Yet there were several pain points which, had I followed through on them, would have, in my opinion, broken the story or turned it into something that I didn't want it to become. When I pushed back and outright rejected enough suggestions, the editor had to remind me that they were there to help. Together we worked to fix those issues, but it took multiple conversations and a lot of brainstorming to get there. Also, there were several comments which I disagree with and outright rejected, largely because they either conflicted with future events within the story, or they would drastically change the characters and take them in ways that I didn't want to go. Once the developmental editor was finished with my manuscript and I had made all the changes, I moved on to the line editor. As the name suggests, line editors go line by line through the manuscript. I've also seen this referred to as a stylistic editor, though that might be a different service altogether. Line editors improve diction and come up with better ways of saying what I intend to say, which may or may not always be the most clear based on what I have in my brain versus what comes out, in this case, my mouth. Kind of like what should have happened with that sentence. The line editor I worked with refined my dialogue and narration in ways to transform a long-winded and rambling paragraph into a single, concise sentence. I was incredibly lucky in terms of quality, timing, and price for the step. All I needed was a month lead-in for her to work through her queue, and another month for her to fully edit my manuscript. The line editor I hired cost me $350, when the average for a 100,000 word manuscript is between $800 and $1,500. Of all the professional editors who worked on my manuscript, I feel like I got the most value out of the line editor. While the developmental editor gave me a lot of big details to fix within my story, it was largely up to me to implement them. Similarly, in the next editing phase, the copy editor, they were focused on grammar rules and similar stylistic choices, many of which are conflicting or based on opinions in terms of whether or not they need to be implemented. This means that I ignored and rejected a significant minority of the suggested changes by the copy editor. Meanwhile, the line editor rewrote sentences in ways that I could easily agree with and see them as improvements to my story. There were plenty of times where I thought, wow, that is a much quippier way of saying what I wanted to. Or, damn, that is an improvement to the character's voice. With my line editor's permission, I'm going to reveal that I hired Morgan Lee. I want to give her a huge shout out because she clearly improved my story and made it flow so much better. Moving on to the next stage, copy editing is what a lot of people think of as official editing, in that it deals with spelling, grammar, repetition, and inconsistent use of points of view. The copy editor came out to $2,300. That was more than I wanted to pay for this service, but they were the only editor I was able to find who could review and edit my manuscript within the near future and within the time frame I had set. All the others wouldn't have even started looking at my manuscript before my current publishing date. This became a lesson learned for me. Next time I will set up overlapping phases within the editing process, where I submit to the next step while I'm working on the current one. That way, I'll have a lot more flexibility in my timeline and won't be so beholden to what I feel is a more expensive service than it should have been. The copy editor did a fine job, and most importantly, they were able to work within my designated timeline. As I mentioned before, though, grammar rules often conflict, and so it fell to my opinion about whether or not I wanted to enforce the suggested changes, and in a significant portion of them, I rejected and ignored them, which is not something that I feel like I wanted to do for a price range which was outside the mid-level for this phase of editing. Lastly is the proofreader, who I got for a whopping $0. They are looking at my manuscript within their spare time, and we set up a trade where I'm also offering my time to help them, so it's not entirely free. In addition, the line editor, and more specifically the copy editor, included proofreading within their bundles, so even though this feels a bit like a risk, I think it's well worth it, and hopefully it'll all work out. I made that decision so that I could reallocate those budgeting funds to book 2, which I'm about to enter into the developmental editing phase. I'm also thinking about creating a Kickstarter to offset the editing and publishing costs of book 2. If I'm successful, and if that works out, definitely expect a video chronicling that effort. Those are the 4 editors I hired to refine my manuscript. So how did I get the money together? The $6,250 price tag is outside most reasonable authors' budgets for their debut novel. I know that I will never recoup that sunk cost from the first book, and that is only the editorial cost. That doesn't include publishing or marketing or the various other infrastructure costs for my writing platform, including the hardware for my recording studio or the software for my writing website. The editorial costs would have been far too much for me were it not for 2 specific things. First of all, around the time when I was going for hiring the developmental and copy editors, I took on extra overtime at work to offset these costs. Also, I've been working on my manuscript for over a decade, and every year I set aside an explicit amount for a budget towards writing, which I haven't really drawn from until I reached the editing phase. Also, as kind of an unofficial third step in terms of budgeting, when I decided to hire the professional editors, I cut back on my other expenses. As I have dreamed for years upon years to publish this novel and ultimately the series, it was barely a consideration in terms of what I was not spending my money on, so I could set aside more towards my writing and this novel. While I had hoped to get the second book in the series out before the end of the year, that's looking less and less feasible, and I'll probably need to push this back to 2023. Unless I can get creative with accounting or find significantly cheaper editing services without sacrificing in quality, I will be publishing the sequel at a much slower rate due to the various editing expenses. If I'm successful with cheaper alternatives, I'll create a follow-up video to this one where I compare the various services in terms of price versus output. So now comes the big question. Were these professional editors worth the money? At every stage, yes. I can see how each editor's experience vastly made my book better and better. With that as a measure, I can almost equate a dollar amount to something subjective like improving my story. Even though I will never sell enough copies of this book to offset the editing costs, let alone all the other expenses associated with publishing it, I am extremely satisfied with every professional editor who helped me make it into something that is incredible. The week that I'm recording this, so way in the past for you all, I hosted the live stream in which I unboxed the physical copies of my book, and I was ecstatic to see what all of our hard work and what all of those dollars I spent had created, and knowing how much it cost to get there, it was worth it. I plan to use everything I learned from the first book to edit and publish the subsequent books in the series more efficiently, and I intend to do so at a much lower cost, all without sacrificing quality. Hopefully it works. The last thing I want to talk about is where I found all these editors. I mostly use Google. Here's a quick rundown of the various editing services which I was able to find, though bear in mind that a lot of them I didn't end up using, so I don't have first-hand experience on the quality of the work that they perform, and largely made my decision based on the cost. Reedsy is an editor for hire website similar to Uber for finding editors. I used them to get a copy editor, though they had all the various different types of editors available. Overall, I had a great experience and they were priced reasonably well. One really cool feature about them is that you can make various submissions, so you can actually get up to 5 potential editors and then choose the best one to fit your needs, whether it's based on time, price, or experience. However, most of the editors have a 1 to 2 month waiting period, so you might want to queue up the next one while you're working on the current editing phase. Also, in terms of free services, Reedsy formats digital copies of our books, even without hiring one of their specific editors. So far, I've used them for 2 different manuscripts, as I needed to normalize the formats from Word into a platform which could easily be used to publish through Ingram Sparks. So I went from Word document to Reedsy to Ingram Spark. It was very seamless and pretty easy to use, considering how many different formats were ultimately in that Word document, and it was a whole mess. Reedsy is slightly limited in the customizations they can make within those documents compared to something I could do within Word, though it was well worth the effort to normalize everything within that book in terms of style, font, format, page layout. It was so easy to use. Next up is Book Editing Associates. I received a quote from them, but didn't go with their services. Honestly, I was intimidated by their repertoire. I felt that they catered to somebody who would have a much bigger budget or a more polished manuscript. Then I got the quote of $750, and it made it seem more like that was an analysis of the manuscript rather than an actual editing service. I don't know if that was stage 1 and I never made it further, but that was my experience and those are my thoughts. I'm probably wrong, but I didn't go with them, so I don't know. Meta Book Editing offered some serious in-depth services, though they weren't what I was looking for with the developmental edit, so I didn't go with that. Editing for Authors offered a comprehensive edit for $2,000, as that would have saved me a decent amount of money compared to the developmental editor I went with. It would have been nice, but I couldn't tell where and which phases or services they actually performed, so I decided not to go with them until I knew more, and at that point I had already found the developmental editor I went with. Manuscript Doctor's services, which I found for $1,500, appeared to be more of a beta read rather than what I was looking for with a full-on editing service. That's probably wrong, but based on what I was able to find, I decided to go with somebody who would do more hand-holding for a more expensive price. Lastly was Mary Cole. Based on her website, her editing services were the most comprehensive, though they were also the most expensive. It would have cost $4,000 for 50,000 words, and as my manuscript was 100,000 words, that would have been $8,000. As I had budgeted $2,000 for each of the editing phases, though again I went over that, her price would have been 4 times what I had budgeted. I covered a lot tonight in rapid succession, so if you want me to highlight anything or expand on any of the details, feel free to post a comment or DM me. I am Ben Pick, and thank you for joining me in Running to Write. If you enjoyed the detailed breakdown about the editing process I went through, please press those like and subscribe buttons. Let me know what editors you've used who have stood out for their incredible quality. Do you agree with my opinions, or is everything I said wrong? I post my running and writing progress on Instagram and Twitter as Running to Write, so be sure to follow me and join in with your own thoughts. Don't forget to sign up for the Running to Write monthly newsletter for regular updates on my story musings, pitfalls, and lessons learned. I'll also include relevant updates for running and writing. See you next time. Until then, plan out your book editing budget. Editing was only one of the many steps to publish my novel, but it was the most expensive.